Technology isn't just a part of our everyday lives anymore. It's become a frontier for global powers, with India right in the mix. So why not join the conversation? Take the Technopolitics survey created by researchers at the Takshashila Institution. It's just 10 simple questions, but your answers could help shape India's strategy in navigating the fast changing world of high tech geopolitics. Your voice matters, so let's make it heard. The link is in the bio.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode of All Things Policy. I'm Anvesha. I work as an assistant program manager at Takshashila Institution. Today we'll be talking about predictive policing, how AI systems for such use cases are deployed in India, and whether this is an effective mode of law enforcement. Predictive policing is an AI use case, so to speak, in law enforcement wherein biometric technologies are used to predict crimes. There has been a considerable increase in deployment of such technologies across countries in the past decade, and these are thought to be a way to reduce crime. However, while its effectiveness is debatable, increased surveillance and reduced privacy for all citizens is an immediate outcome which brings with it additional risks. To discuss this, we were joined today by Disha Verma. Disha researches tech policy and governance and was previously at the Internet Freedom Foundation. She's recently also published a very interesting article on her experience and findings tracking down the use of facial recognition technology for predictive policing to improve women's safety in Lucknow. Hi, Disha. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's lovely to have you here. And to sort of start off, I'd love to hear more about your work and specifically what drew you to this investigation of, predictive policing, especially in Lucknow, and what were the circumstances that sort of encouraged you to do this?
Hi, Anvesha. Thank you for that introduction. I think that covers a lot of it. And just to supplement that, I think in my work in the last few years, I've been looking at state deployment of technologies. And a part of that, of course, has been the emerging reliance on DPIs and AI to perform a lot of governance functions, which includes policing. So I'll begin with what actually drew me to Lucknow specifically. But to preface this, I was looking at trying to build out a project where I look at how public sector agencies and government agencies deploy AI in specific use cases and what those use cases can be. Because, the generative AI fad is not new to anyone. Like we're in the middle of a hype cycle of it, but just general AI as well and predictive systems have been around for a bit and they've been a part of our governance cycles. I just wanted to investigate where that's coming from. So as part of that, I was looking at different sort of local architectures and local contexts in which small offices and agencies have been deploying AI. And what drew me was this 2021 sort of cycle of news reports about Lucknow wanting to do an experiment where they bring about emotion recognition in their surveillance cameras, and they wanted to identify women walking on the streets who look distressed or who look scared for some reason. And the smart AI cameras would catch that distress and notify the local policeman or police station, and they would then come to the rescue of the woman to prevent crime. So the idea at play there is not new. It's prevention of crime through the use of technology and predictive sort of AI systems. And what struck out to me specifically about this was the ability and the confidence of the AI to be able to detect emotions of pedestrians in very loose contexts. So this was a 2021 media cycle, and I didn't see much, or like rather any update on this further. When I was researching this in 2023, 24. So I started looking more into it. I started looking up emotion recognition technology, which is worldwide sort of almost proven to be pseudoscientific and proven to not work. And then that sort of made me more intrigued. And luckily at the time I was also speaking to a friend, Samar Bansal, who was starting his magazine and wanted to sort of look into these sort of questions of where technology interventions are, well placed, and where they aren't. And both of us sort of really loved sitting with this idea of, hey, what's happening in Lucknow? Let's go and find out. So as a result of that, in September, I reached Lucknow and I, cold called a few police officers and a few high-ranking officers, and I said, hey, I want to understand this project that you started in 2021. I want to know what happened. And they drew blanks. They're like, hey, we don't know what you're talking about. This was before our time. We've changed our administration. So why don't you go look at the local architecture of Lucknow surveillance and our safe city project and go find out for yourself what happened? Because we do have a very well set up sort of AI surveillance system with 1,200 cameras that are AI powered, and they do detect crime and they do alert police officers who come to the scene to prevent it from happening. So if that's what you're talking about, go check it out for yourself. And I couldn't say no to that opportunity, and I followed in the footsteps of policemen and the private contractors that provide this architecture and this sort of data ecosystem of this safe city. And in the next sort of week that I stayed in Lucknow, I found many things, and I had many revelations, and all of that is a part of that story, which we can discuss in this episode.
That's absolutely fascinating, the whole background and that context of how you ended up in Lucknow. And obviously the article itself really details out your experience quite well. And so I'm to start off, before we delve deeper into the topic itself, I'm interested to understand how the cops and like the police, the ones who are actually using this technology, how are they reacting to it? And do they see this as an improvement in their infrastructure, or do they think that this is actually helpful in the way that they function and preventing crime, or would they rather see an improvement in the basic infrastructure first? And why is their reaction the way it is?
Great question, and a very interesting sort of realization that happened while I was on the field is that police officers are not using this technology. They're actually quite far removed from it. So this safe city concept and the program, which has been piloted in 8 cities in India, is based on private provisioning of AI systems. It's not rooted in sort of indigenous AI systems, or they're not provided by the government or internally by the police. And like, I don't think in any city. So in Lucknow, I saw the same thing. It's being privately provisioned, and the private provider, yes, they do operate on data provided by the police, such as crime analytics on what to train their AI on, like what are the behavioral factors of a crime, what sort of action in public can allude to a crime, so that they can identify and catch it and alert whatever officers. So this is the infrastructure that it's built on data provided by the police, but it doesn't utilize police infrastructures beyond that. The private provider will provide their own cameras, their own sort of data centers, their own architecture completely. Like, even the communication of the alert from a camera to a potential police officer down the line the pipeline is provided by the private company. So there is a whole layer added on top of existing police networks where this sort of operates on. Now, ideally, in the MOU or in the contracting documents between the private company and the police, ideally this is a very smooth functioning machine wherein there is a camera that watches over an area, and then suddenly a crime is being committed and the AI catches it and alerts somebody sitting in a control room, which is where the private company has its offices. And then it will be validated by a human person. It will then go on back to the sort of command center of the police. So it'll go to like a 112 helpline or a central police helpline, and from there they will validate that again, that okay, this is the camera footage and maybe a crime is occurring, and that police helpline will then deploy police officers to that field, and then they will act on it. So it's a very seamless sort of machinery on paper, but when you actually visit and check out these premises for yourself and the machinery and how it functions for yourself, you will see that there is almost next to no realization of this dream, right? Because you have an AI that is catching, whatever number of crimes it's catching, a overwhelming amount of which are false positives. And then you have some human analysts sort of validating it from the private company's side. But then, rather than sending it to an actual central helpline, which is your police helpline or your police offices, they're not connected to that helpline at all. That connection has not happened. That MOU is still in the works. It's been 2 years. It's not been validated. So what the private company then does is they just call up the local police station and let them know that this is what's happening, or they've set up certain, mobile like vehicles or what they call pink patrol vehicles, specifically for women's safety, which they alert by way of their own telecommunication system, and they say, hey, there might be a crime happening in this area, please let your local police officers know. So it's a very roundabout way of doing what the police already does, which is surveillance and patrolling. So the dream might be something, but in reality, the police is not very, or actually to any extent, involved in the safe city or the AI infrastructure of it. In fact, in my conversations with policemen, most of them at the level of sub-inspectors, inspectors, and havaldars, of course, they didn't know what artificial intelligence is and how they are supposed to use it. But the striking contrast to that is that of course the police use their own technologies. Of course the police has certain technological tools that helps them, or supposedly they're positioned to help them do their jobs better, and their attitude towards those systems are a little different because they have no choice but to interact with them. They are a part of their policing sort of jobs. So again, when you talk about those technological tools, which also I will divide into private and public tools, their attitude changes, right? So what I noticed, and which was very, very interesting to me, is that whenever a private company is providing policing tools to the police, which they have to use, which they're almost, at some points compelled to use, like Trinetra in the case of Lucknow, which is provided by Stacku Technologies, which is a facial recognition tool, and the policeman can essentially upload a picture of a suspect and see if something matches that picture of somebody has already been logged into the system. And the sort of dream here is to have such a vast network of pictures in your arsenal that you just run a sort of a reverse image search and you're connected with the actual person that has been either suspected or accused or proven guilty of a crime. That is the dream. That is the imagination. But again, it's not working well at all. It's been in place for about 2 years as well, similar to the Safe City. And the police, the inspectors and sub-inspectors that I spoke to, have a very negative and very sort of dismissive outlook to this tool and to other tools that have been provided by private companies. One such is Crime GPT, which is supposed to be this sort of magical generative AI tool that the police can pump in information into, and then they'll give them matching results as to what criminal can this match with. And the police seems to have a very sort of negative view of it, saying, hey, we don't really want to use this. We don't have the time to use this. We would rather be doing real policing. We'd rather be on the field and catching suspects and criminals ourselves. This is just sort of one of those things that has been imposed onto us, and we really don't have any stakes in this. But on the other side, you look at public or like more indigenous technology tools, which have been developed in-house by Indian police systems or by the Home Department centrally. And those carry a sort of tinge of pride for policemen, right? So you have something called CCTNS, which is the Crime and Criminal Tracking Networking Systems. You have something called NAFIS, which is the new and upcoming sort of fingerprint identification system. Or you have NatGrid, which is a very popular sort of anti-terrorism system. They have a lot of pride in using these systems, and it's also part of their police training to know how to use these systems. So when I spoke to them about NatGrid or NAFIS or CCTNS, they said, yes, of course, they're cutting edge, they're amazing. We can't do our work without them. In fact, there's a separate CCTNS cell within each police force at district level. So we need those tools. But even within those tools, they had very legitimate complaints. They said to me things like, hey, these server speeds are very low. We need basic, search functions. We need basic recommender systems within CCTNS, for instance, to generate a character certificate. So they had a very, very good list of suggestions which could improve their experience and their policing outcomes by a lot. But instead of plugging those very basic gaps, we see a very, very aggressive thrust of privately provisioned technologies within police forces. And this thrust is coming from upstairs, right? It's coming from administrative police officers. It's coming from home departments within states. And when I spoke to an actual IPS officer who was at a DCP position in Lucknow, he seemed to be extremely proud of pushing these privately provisioned tools. And he said that the way forward for any police force is to join hands with the private sector and to move in unison. So the lay of the land is actually very interesting when it comes to tech.
That's indeed extremely interesting, and thank you so much for delving into that in so much detail. And I think when we talk about, I mean, immediately, as you said, private companies, the first thing that comes to mind is privacy, since there's such a huge amount of data that's not only used for, deploying these tools and training them. There's also a lot of data that's then generated through the way in which these sort of tools are used, and also with the recent digital personal data protection rules that have come in. What do you think is the impact of the Data Protection Act that we have, and how would that maybe protect citizens from surveillance, or does it go the opposite way? Does it in any way protect citizens from, third parties? In this case, not quite third party, but does it protect from the way in which individuals' data is used for training these tools, and then also in the way in which the data later is collected for analysis and other such things? How do you see the Data Protection Act impacting this whole ecosystem?
So I think I'll start on a more optimistic note now that we finally have the data protection rules that have come up for public consultation, but they will soon be sort of implemented. It's good to have a data protection regime to begin with, because so far we've been operating on pretty much a vacuum, and that's scarier than anything else. So that is all. In terms of optimism, that's all I have to offer, because when you
Yeah.
then go further, you do realize that there are certain deficiencies in the law and in the rules when read conjunctively that really doesn't offer much respite to the situation. I'd say that because of two reasons. One is that, as you said, these private companies are able to amass a very, very large amount of data. And in fact, I saw a lot of this happening in real time where, that 1,200 cameras were just being sort of condensed into one big screen. And I could see the faces of random people from Lucknow who don't know that I'm watching them, their faces being extracted and being attributed a certain profile number and attributed a certain gender and age. So their faces are being collected and stored in some capacity, in some format with the private company. When I asked the private provider what they intend to do with these faces, they said that first and foremost, this builds and trains the AI. Like you said, it's very essential to make the AI fast and accurate, and the AI will become sharp and extremely precise by being trained on this publicly available data, which is people's faces on the streets. So there is, yes, indeed, a large amount of data being collected of faces. Now, facial data is biometric data. It's perhaps our most unique identifier, and it's one of those data points that we don't consent to giving, right? When you're out and about in the world, your facial data can be collected by anybody without your consent. So that makes it a very highly sensitive category of data. But what we see here in the DPDP Act and the rules, which is very different from the IT regime that we had earlier, is that there is no separate categorization for highly sensitive data, right? Because the earlier IT rules said that there was something called the SPDI rules, or sensitive personal data rules, which said that certain categories of information, like your banking information, your health information, your sexuality, or your biometric data, which includes thumbprint, handprint, face, iris, etc., are so highly vulnerable to being abused and harmed that they are categorized as a different category. And then you have to follow different kinds of sort of safeguarding and protection models. And the breach of that category of data will attract, of course, higher penalties and higher consequences. We don't have that categorization in the DPDP rules and act anymore. We've done away with this one step above sort of protection. So all we have is just personal data. So your email and your facial biometric today stand at the equal sort of footing in terms of the law. And that is problematic to begin with, because we could have really done with this separate categorization given the proliferation of facial recognition based technologies that are coming up in India. There's many of them, and it's sort of becoming the norm. And what the DPDP Act and rules do is to normalize this further, right? So that is one. Second is that at many instances in the rules, there are enough provisions that make an exception for law enforcement and make an exception for data to be shared by public authorities to private authorities without consent being taken as well. So both of these are very harmful. For instance, Section 17 will tell you that if Section 17 of the Act, that is, that if you're collecting any sort of personal data and you're processing it, it can be shared, or a law enforcement agency can ask access or seek access to that data without the consent of the data subject, which is us. And then the fiduciary will have to provide it to them. So there is a full sort of pathway there for law enforcement agencies to tap into any sort of personal data and take it for their use. So if the private company is processing facial data, it can be provided to the police willy-nilly at whatever instance that the police would like. And there's very sweeping exemptions for that. And on the other end, if the police has data, and and law enforcement is of course one of those wings of the Indian sort of polity that can do whatever it pleases without many legal safeguards and sort of checkpoints. So if the police has certain data that is sensitive and personal, they can also take the call of sharing it further with other private agencies if the need arises on their end. So there are glaring deficiencies in the DPDP Act and rules that don't really solve for the increasing and frankly very scary proliferation of facial recognition technologies. And further, I would even say that it kind of normalizes it.
Thank you so much. That's also quite helpful to understand where the governance regime comes in. And maybe taking this a step further, when we talk about predictive policing as a whole in India, I mean, there's also, Telangana and Cyberabad where we've seen a lot of these sort of technologies coming into play. But there's quite a lack of public awareness on how these different government projects are being used, and how they're primarily using a huge chunk of the budget for AI for crime prevention. And so maybe if you could delve a bit into how other such models are being deployed in India, and sort of which sort of states these are coming in, what are the primarily what are the use cases, and whether they've already been deployed, or something of that sort is being planned. If you could maybe sort of lay the land for how it looks like across India.
Sure, I'll be happy to do that. Obviously, we know that Telangana and Delhi are sort of, and Hyderabad, Cyberabad are sort of surveillance capitals in India. But I think the day is long gone where we used to look at these cities as like unique case studies and then understand or even be horrified at the scale of surveillance deployment in these cities, because it's quite ubiquitous now. And I think there are multiple reasons for that. There's also a policy push. There is major sort of central push towards surveillance that's come up in the last few years, but we'll get to that in a minute. In terms of lay of the land, I think Telangana has inspired a lot of surveillance models, but it's also inspired a lot of private public partnerships, that their surveillance models, of course, it's community oriented, it's private markets oriented. Telangana has gone as far as to give their own citizens apps to alert the police if a crime is happening, which is majorly almost exclusively used for moral policing and to just point out couples just harmlessly roaming about in parks. But there's a community policing angle also coming up in Telangana. So I think these models and the kind of relationships between police, private, and public that they're kind of motivating and encouraging across India is a little concerning to me. So, borrowing from that, we have something called Utkrisht Society model that's coming up, which is a very complicated Hindi word, which I also don't necessarily mean what I know what it means, but essentially at hyperlocal levels or at city or district levels or commissionerate levels would be more accurate. The police is inviting private players as big as Microsoft or even Coca-Cola to join hands and to together solve for major policy issues such as environment or education or waste sanitation or women's safety. Women's safety is a big one. And the way that they'll do that is sort of up in the air. It's very, very new. We have seen this come up in Gurgaon or in Haryana. So a few big private players are joining hands with the police, which at least from what I understand, could be in terms of providing AI systems to do that, or maybe funding to do that, either way. But yeah, this private and public model to govern and to police has definitely stemmed from Telangana. And it's creeping into different sort of cities and different states at different speeds and different modalities. But UP is a very interesting state for me because it's really adopted prison and policing technologies very, very quickly. So Statue Technologies is a big provider of technologies to police forces across states. I think they're provisioning to 8 states at the moment. And in UP, they've set up this high precision, in their words, high precision prison surveillance network, which is also called Trinetra, but it's a completely different Trinetra, which connects about 70 prisons across UP to a central control room so that one sort of board of people can keep an eye on prisoners and sort of prevent untowardly behavior by prisoners. And this is something that we haven't seen before at this scale, because not only are they tracking the faces or actions of criminals, they're also tracking emotion, they're tracking behavior, they're tracking how they move, how they interact with each other. So it's a very sort of panoptic sort of situation that we've created in UP. And again, they've taken this name and they've taken the same technology provider, StarQ. They've taken this inspiration to provide other sort of tools to UP police forces, starting with Lucknow, which is your Trinetra facial recognition system. You have something called Crime GPT, which is on their phones. Then you're going further to develop a Trinetra-like system in Maharashtra, specifically in Nagpur, which is also by StarQ Technologies, called Simba. And Simba is also a smart policing tool that will help them do facial recognition or even like speech recognition, and use intelligent systems. And they use very vague terms because in reality we know that it's not really happening to the extent that they say that it is. So these are certain like concerns to me. Other than that, I think Goa is coming up in usual sort of surveillance models, but it won't be too far when they get into the private provisioning model as well. And I won't be surprised if this is something that takes off in 2025. I mean, I hope it doesn't, but it's definitely on my 2025 bingo card that more states sort of get into this groove of getting their technologies from private players, which is unfortunate.
Very rightly said. I mean, that's quite a dystopic landscape, to be very honest. And maybe if we go a bit beyond law enforcement and look at another very troubling use of AI that we've seen, quite recently, is AI being deployed in public service delivery. So, wherein, just for the audience's context, where AI is being used to sort of create this 360-degree profile of individuals, especially those who apply for public services and welfare schemes, and to essentially check their eligibility for such services and schemes. For example, last year, I think in Jan, there was a report in Al Jazeera which sort of talked about one such, use of AI in Telangana again, called the Samagra Vedika, where a lot of, I think, in thousands, people were denied access to this particular welfare scheme, which would provide them with food. And a lot of, once the reporters investigated, they found that a lot of those denials were just because of algorithmic errors. And for example, two people having the same name, one person is not eligible, one is. And when the person who is eligible applies for the scheme, they get denied because their profile is being confused with the other person who isn't eligible. And then there's also that sort of very high level of trust in these systems on part of the government officials that deploy it or are sort of the middlemen in the whole system. And then they also refused to to grant eligibility based on physical proof provided by those who were wrongfully marked as uneligible. So when we look at such similar deployments of AI in public service delivery, and also with DPIs, all of this sort of forms a part of digital public infrastructure as well. So how do you think the future of DPIs with this sort of AI implementation will look, and how would it affect citizens? I know we've already seen quite a lot of troubling evidence of this going in the wrong direction and sort of excluding more people than really being an inclusive system as the DPIs are projected to be. So what are your views on the future of DPIs with AI?
No, very rightly said, Anvesha. I think the context setting is also helpful here. I think everything you've pointed to already answers that question. I think DPI is based on very on assumptions that are a little far from reality, I would say, in a country that hasn't had a national census since 2011, which is 13, 14 years ago. It's a little difficult to rely on data sets, and it's obviously a little improbable to assume that the data sets that we have in terms of our population census or in terms of what kind of people need what kind of welfare are not I mean, it's improbable to say that they're reliable to begin with, right? So you already have a flawed foundation for implementing DPI. But then you go a step further and to automate entitlements and delivery of services that are essentially constitutionally guaranteed, then we actually run into really, really big troubles. So, like you said, the Al Jazeera piece that comes from this series of reporting that was done by the Reporters Collective. The series is called Algorithms of Exclusion. It's a brilliant, brilliant showcase of how automation in these essentially welfare state services can really undermine our constitutional values and undermine the bargaining power of the poor as well. So you have use cases like Samagra Vedika, where in Telangana almost every welfare benefit is being delivered through automation, or you have different and more specific use cases like pension being disbursed in Haryana or other states through the use of automation. This is not necessarily AI almost all of the times. It can be in many cases, but most of the times it's just simple automation, simple just machines doing what machines do. But then you're feeding the machine or the AI, whatever it is, you're feeding it highly flawed data sets, and you're feeding it material that is not reflective of the Indian reality. Like you said, spellings being different, there being typos between a PAN card and an Aadhaar card. And if there's such discrepancies, the machine will not know that this is an Indian problem to have, where you spell, Akash with a double A or a single A, for instance. This is not something that the machine will have consciousness to determine. So obviously what you end up with is mass exclusion, and you end up with harrowing false negatives in most cases. And that is something that we cannot afford as a welfare state, because it leads to actual harm, which is very, very tangible in populations. And I'm not saying that harms like privacy being exploited or abused is not tangible. That is definitely tangible. But here the harm of not being given food, of not being given pension, of not being given housing or employment or whatever other welfare you require from the state can very well result in debt, which it has in the past. So very recently, the Pension Parishad and the Majdoor Kisan sort of Sangharsh Sangathan, they did a press conference about people in Rajasthan who were being denied pensions to a degree that they had, endured loss of life and endured loss of loved ones for not being paid meager pensions by the state. So this is the reality of our DPIs and the reality of AI in the public sector. It's definitely grim for sure. And I don't know what the answer to this is, because it seems to be an almost undeniable and unstoppable force with which we are integrating AI systems into DPI. What I do worry about is how much we're relying on predictive systems now, such as these predictive policing models, because you're already dealing with flawed data sets, on top of which you're dealing with high amounts of digital illiteracy, where people are not going to be understanding what they are dealing with, and that can have very, very dire consequences on their lives. And on top of that, you're introducing systems of predictive sort of models and predictability, which I would say, and many others would also demonstratedly argue, are not based on like scientific truths. They're definitely flawed, and they're not correct. They're sometimes pseudoscience, they're sometimes snake oil even. So there's many layers of issues and many layers of concerns that tech researchers have had with this. And just to add a little bit from experiences that I've looked at local food security systems, not from a tech standpoint. This is before I worked in tech. And there's a very interesting anecdote that comes to mind, is that introducing technology to a population that doesn't understand it not only makes them feel nervous and makes them feel scared to go and ask for their entitlements, because they're going to have to deal with all these machines. It also skews local power dynamics quite a bit. For instance, if my family needs ration and I've gone to the fair price shop to avail of it, I'm going to have to do biometric authentication, iris authentication, now even facial recognition authentication, all of that. And if I don't do it, and if I start arguing with the middleman or the fair price shop dealer, he's going to start arguing back with me. He's going to say things like, this is Modi's wish that you do biometric authentication. And it's going to skew relationships with middlemen. It's going to skew local power dynamics. And we've seen this happen. And Jean Jaurès, for instance, has written a lot about this as well. So it's not just the technological harms, but also very real sort of socio-political harms that can happen through something like an AI-based DPI in the public sector.
Absolutely, absolutely. Completely agree with that. And this has been like a completely fascinating episode, and there's so much more to discuss on these topics. But just in the interest of time, I'll maybe like to close with one last question on if we go back to what you said previously about the facial recognition and the predictive policing systems being used in Lucknow, and you mentioned that there's extremely high rates of false positives, and you've even written about this in your article. Do you think that, since these schemes and all these technologies are technically funded by public money, do you think that such use of public money is justified? And especially given that the policy aims at, improving women's safety, is this the right way to go if you want to improve women's safety, or are there other alternatives that come to mind, which would be a better use of this, taxpayers' money in terms of protecting women?
All right, I'll keep this brief as well. I think I can answer this in two parts. One is the surveillance angle, and one is the again sort of cost-effective angle of all of this. So I think both answers are similar, have similar outcomes, which is to say that this is not a very good use of a taxpayer's money, or even a good use of the central fund that this is all drawing from, which is a Nirbhaya fund. Now, Nirbhaya fund is unique. It's a huge corpus of money, which is specifically dedicated to women's safety. And it's a demand-driven fund, which is to say that if you ask for this much money of the Ministry of Women and Child or of the Ministry of Home Affairs, which practically together run this fund, you will get as much you want, right? But the reality of that is that for many different externalities, projects that have actually helped women, for instance, one-stop centers, which are also community centers located in different sort of decentralized locations, where the physical shelters where women can come in when they face some sort of sexual harassment on the streets, or domestic violence or abuse at home. They can come to these physical shelters and ask for legal or medical help, and they can get help filing a complaint. They can get help accessing healthcare, or just sleep the night there, just stay there for as long as they can, or they want to escape the violence so that they're enduring, right? So these are very important spaces of shelter and community, and honestly just safety for women. But we have seen, and again, the Reporters Collective, specifically a journalist called Tapasya, has done some insane work on mapping how they've completely dwindled across the years, because the funding has dropped massively. Why this has happened is that we rely on some very empty statistics to determine whether or not women need these funds. For instance, during the pandemic, there were very low reports of domestic violence. And the reason for that is not because domestic violence wasn't happening. In fact, it was happening way more than ever, because people, and men and women, were both home. But they weren't being reported because women didn't have the avenues to go out of their house and report it. So because of that empty statistic, the funding got cut, right? That's one way in which the funding for shelter homes and community spaces like this can get slashed. And what happens is that now you have understaffed and under-maintained shelter homes that women can't access because there's nobody there. So these are places that actually might have, or have a really important role to play in the infrastructure, but they're not being funded out of a fund that is essentially made for this very purpose, right? In fact, what we're doing instead with this money is pouring just thousands of crores of rupees into something like an AI surveillance city, which, as I reported in my story, doesn't work. It yields such a high and unimaginably high amount of false positives, and it doesn't really reach the police or even the woman that's affected by it. So there is no resolution or no outcome of this extremely expensive experiment, let's call it that, because it is a pilot stage. I definitely see ways and avenues in which this money would rather be directed, but unfortunately the policy priority seems to be something else. It seems to be surveillance, and that's where my second point comes in, is that demonstratedly we have time and again been screaming, I think, in civil society, and researchers and tech policy folks specifically have been screaming that surveillance doesn't mean low crime. Like, just because you have a camera, it doesn't mean that you're not going to have crime. And that's been very difficult to prove or disprove, because the nature of things is very psychosocial more than anything. But we know from becoming surveillance capitals, for instance, Delhi is a surveillance capital, but the crime rate hasn't dropped. So again, I am concerned about our priorities being, very, very highly skewed towards a tool that is tech savvy but isn't proven to work. And what has actually proved to work and has actually provided women with actual respite and shelters is not being looked at all. So I will definitely hope in the future that we pay more attention to actual solutions instead of tech solutions, which don't always work.
Absolutely. And I mean, this whole thing is a very social problem, and just putting one tech layer on top of it cannot solve anything really, and requires much
Absolutely.
deeper, initiatives to improve it from a ground level. But with that, I think we've had a very, very detailed, candid conversation. It's been very eye-opening. And Disha, it's always a pleasure to speak with you. This has been a great episode. And I hope to have you back again for another such conversation on the podcast. And thank you, everyone in the audience, for listening in. And with that, we come to the end of the episode. Thank you so much, Disha.
Thank you, Anvesha. Always a pleasure speaking to you as well. Thank you.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle at Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.